My name's Chris Weston. Let me start off with the introduction. I sort of did some reading when I was doing my masters on sort of Immanuel Wallerstein. I can't pretend to be an expert, but I actually think the approach is quite useful for looking at a country like North Korea, and particularly the sort of the examination of the sort of interactions. That's the thing I really want to convey today. The interactions amongst the economic, the political, the military, and also the cultural factors. It's also the sort of something that I personally have always had a strong interest, which is in long-term historical development. So that also brings something to it. And of course, Wallerstein's 4-volume literally goes from the 16th century all the way up to the 20th century. So I won't be quite extending it that far to North Korea, but certainly I think to get an understanding of North Korea's history is quite important to understanding where it is now, and possibly where it might also go in the future. And then also this concept of a large-scale and holistic approach. So that's what I want to try and use the Wallerstein analysis for. I've mentioned the approach using world system analysis. I think I've mentioned the fact that I have a very strong bent for history. I'm fascinated by the movements of history and how that affects economics and also political development. And particularly the Northian framework, the concept of limited access order, open access order, but with particular emphasis on North's final recent two books, which deal with this whole issue of limited access order and violence capacity, and how people evolve into what systems called open access order, in which he describes South Korea as being one of those open access order countries. Literature review I'll do very, very briefly. Wallerstein I've mentioned, but the particular, again, individual that I feel slightly more relevant to is Michael Mann, which Pavlo I think referred to, and again these interactions between ideological, economic, military and political factors. So, just to go back to the Wallerstein, I picked this up from reading a book on that covered aspects of world system analysis by a guy called Yo, and he talks about the sort of three strategies that companies who are in the peripheral, which he defines, trying to move away from there. And those are seizing the chance, promotion by invitation, and self-reliance. Self-reliance, I just want to make one comment on. North Korea's ideology for the last 40 years is juche, which is actually translated as self-reliance. So this self-reliance is quite an interesting concept that's mentioned, as said, by Wallerstein. And it's interesting how that has driven North Korea's development over the last 40-50 years, and why it's really arrived at the position that it has. Though I would also say that there's also been a combination of other factors out there that have also contributed to that, which I'll come onto in a moment. So what I would say about just looking at North Korea over the past recent history is that it's generally embraced one of these three, with particular emphasis on the self-reliance, but not only. I think it's also tried at particular points in time to try and break out and try and become something what I call become a member of what I call a shadow core. And I think the way I would explain shadow is by reference to, in the UK, we have an opposition to the government, which is the leading party is called the shadow cabinet. So it's a sort of opposing the core. But it's also slightly ephemeral. A shadow is not quite specific, it's a reflection of something. And that's what I try to get at with this concept of a shadow core. The core, obviously, clearly identified by Wallerstein as those countries within the sort of, primarily sort of Western Europe, the Atlantic, United States, UK, Europe, and as it's brought members into that. But that's the sort of core, whereas North Korea, by virtue of the path that it's sought to adopt, has tried to become a shadow core. And I'll explain to you in a moment what I mean by that with some concrete examples. Okay, so Michael Mann, North Korea, economic choice is influenced by culture, the ideology, leadership. The armed forces are particularly important in North Korea. They've very much at the heart of North Korea's establishment was the Korean People's Army. In fact, the Korean People's Army is actually the oldest institution. It actually predates the establishment of the North Korean state. It actually precedes the formation of the Korean Workers' Party, which was the primary political force in North Korea. And in fact, part of the legend that's been established in North Korea is, in fact, rather than the army being formally established in, I think, early 48, because Kim Il-sung, who's the first leader, this is the guy in the top, who's the first leader of North Korea, the way I would sort of put it is because of the legend and the myths that are being built up by the sort of North Korean leadership and the Kim family, there's actually an attempt to sort of backdate the existence of the army to the 1930s, when Kim Il-sung was fighting in Manchuria, which is China, not Korea. Korea was very much under lockdown by the Japanese forces, and therefore the fight against Japanese colonialism was actually taken into Manchuria, China, where Kim Il-sung was leading a band of partisans. Those people effectively, with Kim Il-sung, ran the country. In fact, their children and grandchildren are the people who are currently running the country today. On a diagrammatic basis, this is what I've tried to put together. Again, leading from the sort of the top left, the culture, this sort of anti-colonial, that we were occupied by Japan for the better part of 45 years. The Russians got rid of them and the Americans got rid of them, but we don't want anyone colonizing us. We define ourselves by virtue of our anti-colonial background. Very much anti-American by virtue of the involvement of the United States in the affairs of North Korea from 1945 onwards, and of course what happened during the Korean War from 1950 to 53. And there's also this overriding Korean exceptionalism. We are special. We are better than most people. We are superior to everyone. Some of that has come out in some quite ugly stories about sort of Korean women who've been over in China, who've come back with Chinese children, obviously treated quite badly. But there's a sort of we are the cleanest race, and this whole sort of nature, we are very much above everyone else. The ideology, leadership. When I was in Cuba on a holiday, the thing I noticed were very few photos, portraits of Fidel Castro or even the brother Raúl, but a lot of portraits of a guy called Jose Marti, who was the I think he was an anti-United States opponent in the late 19th century. And of course the ubiquitous portraits of Che Guevara. I don't say that I invented, but I got this sort of, there's ideology and iconic photos to bring this thing together. And I think you saw that in this earlier portrait of Kim Il-sung, the sort of the sun god, the sort of the golden statues of Kim Il-sung and Kom-ying, his son Kim Jong-il, golden statues of them in Pyongyang, and this sort of ubiquitous sort of portraits and everywhere devoted to him. So this is this iconology, and also the Yuche, which originally arose from 1955. Kim Il-sung gave a speech basically saying, why is it I go to all these classrooms and I see pictures of Pushkin and Mayakovsky. You know, what's happened to Korean culture? You know, what are these Russians doing here? You know, okay, we took their aid, but my view is, you know, we have Korea, why aren't we looking at Korean culture? So that was the sort of the birth of Yuche, and of course it was his son, Kim Jong-il, who ended up, by virtue of his position, his background was the organisation and guidance department of the Korean Workers' Party. He was very much involved in the late 60s, early 70s, broadening out this sort of Yuche Kim Il-sungism as a sort of an ideology, the direct descendant of Karl Marx and Engels and Leninist thought. The armed forces I've alluded to. The figures on the involvement of the military in North Korea are still shrouded, but I think people I've talked to, and based on my readings, I actually gave a talk on the Korean People Army yesterday in Warsaw, is that they probably have about 30 to 40% of GDP is under their control. They have the massive involvement in the construction sectors, the agricultural sectors, they own mines, they're heavily involved in this entrepreneurial economy that's been growing for the last 20 years since problems developed, you know, in terms of sort of protection. You know, a lot of the 1 million supposed manpower is really devoted to commercial activities. They've also got the nuclear missile program. Legislation, I think one of our earlier speakers talked about rule of man. That is North Korea written over. And the example that I would look at is something like the special economic zones, where I was jotting down some thoughts on that earlier. And what I would say is, yes, it's sort of special economic zones started thinking, they thought about it, brought some legislation in the early 80s. This was a sort of what I would say, a benign skepticism. We're not sure it's going to work. Chinese are doing it. Okay, it's worth a try, but we're not. We're pretty skeptical that it will actually contribute anything. In the 90s, when the economy collapsed totally, I think there was more of a sort of anything goes, I think we better think about this, and they started talking about sort of zones up near the Russian, the Chinese border, but brought in a bit more legislation, but still we're not sure, we're hedging. And then once the sunrise policy began with South Korea in the late 80s, early 90s, which again I'll come back to, more of a sort of opportunistic anxiety. Yes, we can get the money, but we're not sure about what the effect will be on the population. So you have crazy things like the sort of the Mount Kumgang tourist resort, which wasn't quite a special economic zone, but it's a major tourist development. Because the North Korean authorities didn't trust their population, what did they do to staff this facility? They brought Korean-speaking Chinese from across the border to staff this complex because they did not trust their own population. And, you know, there's sort of, you know, the rule of man. If you look at particularly this Kaesong industrial complex, which I'll talk to again, just to give you, you know, the reality is that this is a major employer, frankly, of Korea, North Korea, even though it only has probably, I think, about 50,000 people working in it, but it generates around about 90% of North Korea's exports. It's really a major contributor to the deficit, trade deficit that it has principally with China. And yet, you know, it was closed because of sensitivities that the South Koreans were saying that you're making this money, which is all going into the leadership's pocket. You know, even though there was quite reasonable amount of legislation, this thing would operate, you know, without interference from the government. And what you've also got is internal and external factors. I don't have too much time to talk about those in too much detail, but I'll give you an example. Again, the sort of issues, what are things about North Korea is, unlike South Korea, it declined to come to terms with its former colonial oppressor, Japan. And I think one of the things that's fitted in with the special economic zones is that there's always been a thought at the back of North Korea is that we're not going to pay for any of this infrastructure. The Japanese will pay for it. They will pay for it. They'll get the Japanese construction companies to put in all this infrastructure that we need on our side of the border to deal with any expanded developments. But sometimes, to borrow an expression of Harold Macmillan, events always tend to turn up that provide an insurmountable obstacle. So with Japan starting to warm up to relations in the 90s and the early 2000s, becoming a major donor of aid, probably on the verge of coming to some terms with North Korea about the legacy that it left behind and to make some serious payments, you then have the problems of the kidnapping of Japanese citizens being brought to North Korea, some of them dying, the North Koreans probably not wanting to own up to the full story, and suddenly Japan puts everything on hold. That potential relationship or potential deal that might benefit is put on hold because of external factors. Because obviously the Japanese electorate would not tolerate a deal with people when there's still missing people to be accounted for. So you've got those external factors. The economic choices that have arisen, heavy industry is very much tied into the military-industrial complex. It's also part of the ideology of Juche, self-reliance. We don't want to be part of the outside world. We just want to concentrate on our own domestic market. The farmers' markets in the 90s with the public distribution system collapsing. This was basically a system that gave a minimum ration to all people in North Korea. This effectively collapsed from a very varying number of factors. Part of it was the drought, but also major economic problems developing in the agricultural field. Suddenly, markets became very important. This was the only way to feed people. The famine in 96, 97 is believed to have cost North Korea about 400,000 people. Some estimates go up to about 1 million, 2 million. I think those estimates are slightly overdone, but it was a severely traumatic period for North Korea and the leadership. And the farmers' markets, which up until then had been barely tolerated, suddenly became a very important way of feeding people, which the government clearly could not do. Again, the authorities tried to close them down in the mid-2000s but failed. Special economic zones I've talked about. But all these factors come together and create where North Korea is and where it's going to go in the future. Development. I talk a bit about the history, but prior to the 1900s, it was very much a tributary state of China. Between 1900 and 45, it became a peripheral state of Japan. And particularly in the 30s and 40s, because of the war that was going on in China, Korea, particularly North Korea, became a vital part of Japanese military economy. I think the figures I saw was that at one point it was sort of providing a good 30% of the total armaments for Japan. The Japanese did a lot of development in North Korea, hydroelectric dams, a lot of the industries were all built there. Even the big nitrogen works, I think, were tied in with the Japanese biological warfare program. But Korea became a sort of a peripheral part of the Japanese empire. A lot of the industries firms were staffed by Japan. It was wholly dominated by Japanese management and executives and business trusts. Effectively, they never got to that final stage of development. They were very much dealing with the intermediate goods. So Japan would ship them something. It would then get shipped over to what was South Korea, and then brought back to Japan. So it was very much a peripheral part of the Japanese economy. When Japanese were forced out, North Korea was starting to become part of a peripheral state of the USSR, which was embodying still the Soviet-occupied part of Manchuria, and was really being sort of, this is what we want, we just want primary goods, we want your mineral resources, but we don't want you to bother with any manufacturing. And this is another example of how the external factors suddenly drive choices that the North Koreans, this is also part of the reason why Juche arose. We don't want to be part of the Soviet run economy. We don't want to be part of Comecon. We want to be on our own. We want to determine our own future. We're going to build up our heavy industry, and if I can put it bluntly, to hell with the rest of the world. It's as simple as that. The Korean War, 1950 to 53, I think was a sort of an example of North Korea trying to seize the chance. You have to remember that virtually all of the agriculture production was actually in South Korea. This is where all the rice paddies were. North Korea, looking at it geographically, is about 80% mountainous. Very little area there for arable, rural. So, if they could get that part of South Korea, they had a very good chance of, making it out on their own as a sort of breakout from the peripheral. But it collapsed with, obviously, the American involvement and the heavy bombing thereafter, which made them very reliant on aid from both China and the Soviet Union. Self-reliance, we talked about. This is where I think they want to become shadow core. And I was conscious in the title that The Last Man Standing might give a sort of reference to the film of the spaghetti western, where somehow the North Koreans are playing off the Russians against the Chinese. I don't think so. I think Pyongyang has actually ended up trying to be a third part of the triangle. It's needed both the Soviet Union and the China. And I think it was, sometimes it was almost the victim of those relationships by virtue of the fact that the Soviets cut them off from military aid at particular points in time, which led the North Koreans to think about, again, how we have to rely on ourselves. That ultimately would lead them to go down the nuclear route. I don't want to talk too much about North because, again, I'm conscious about time, but I was quite interested in the sort of, North's concepts of the centrality of violence, but rents. I keep on coming back to this rents, particularly in North Korea and the Korean People's Army. And it's the fact that 20 to 30% at one point of all the government expenditures were going into the Korean People's Army. It's also the amount of resources that have been devoted to the KPA, the military first policy, the concentration on the heavy industry to build up a sort of an indigenous military strength, and also the sort of, again, the protection services that the KPA were engaging in after the 90s when the market. So, but I don't want to talk too much. I want to go back to North Korea. Problem as someone with my economic background is I'd obviously quite like to see the statistics. Problem with North Korea is that they basically gave up giving any sort of statistics on their economy in the 1960s. I've seen one report, it's very closely argued, that, I think it was produced in 1975. They're saying in 1970 the South Korean economy was 1/3 of the size of North Korea. So, all intents and purposes, North Korea was viewed by everyone, up until certainly the mid-70s, as being the far more successful of the two. And I've seen that throughout all the literature. No one's really sort of doubted it. I say in my paper, I just still wonder whether those statistics were really quite as accurate as everyone thinks. And when I look at the underlying paper, there's a first, you know, the assumption is the statistics are true, the statistics are there, you know, and therefore on that basis, this is what we've come up with. Well, I'm sceptical, I have to say. I think there were already problems developing in the late 60s. I think the big indicator is that the 5-year plan that was announced in 62 was extended by another 3 years because they'd announced a significant build-up in the 60s. But I still sort of think about, you know, on a sort of an institutional background, if you think about South Korea was also being run by quite a heavy-handed dictatorship. You know, why did sort of South Korea go out ahead of North Korea? It had a better endowment, it had industrial assets. They were devastated by the Americans, but they were rebuilt. They seem to have basically built themselves a reasonable heavy industry base, whereas South Korea was very, very heavily reliant on US aid throughout the 50s and 60s. So I sort of come back to this sort of, well, what did happen to North Korea? Why did it? And to be perfectly blunt, I have to say to you, I haven't got any answers, and all the literature also doesn't have any answers. They're still not quite clear what happened to North Korea. But I think we've got some ideas as to what happened to South Korea, and I'll come on to that, because I think the professor at the back raised that as an issue in one of the early discussions. But at the back of my mind is this whole issue of the aid, because a lot of the authors on North Korea say, well, you know, North Korea's always been reliant on aid, and you know, when the Soviet Union collapsed and China, who were major sort of providers of aid, you know, it was inevitable. You know, well, hold on a minute, if we think about South Korea was one of the major recipients of aid from the United States. In it was run, as said, by a military dictatorship. 1965, Park and South Korea did a deal with Japan, and they got a very, very substantial amount of money from the Japanese, part of the reparations. That was ploughed into some of the industrial ventures. You also look at South Korea, that was, you know, a lot of Japanese money came into that country in the late 60s, early 70s. So there's massive foreign direct investment from Japan. And South Korea effectively became a peripheral state of Japan. And I would say the thing about North Korea is that this exceptionalism and this juche self-reliance has been the thing that distinguishes them. They don't want the Japanese money, or when they tried to get it, it suddenly became impossible. They certainly were recipients of reasonable amounts of aid by the Soviet Union and China, but never to the extent that the South Koreans were. I think you must also take into consideration that you had both a direct and indirect link into the sort of world economy developing with South Korea that never happened with the North Koreans. One of those is actually almost at the back of the centre of North, which is violence, which is that, you know, South Korea was given a significant amount of aid by the United States for its involvement in the Vietnam War from the mid-60s. I mean, the amounts involved are tens of billions of dollars in those days. And I have to say, I think that has got to be one reason why. I think the United States provided an umbrella by virtue of the fact that, again, one of those facts that are also not well covered in literature is that tens of thousands of South Koreans went to Saudi Arabia to engage in construction. So there was a gross, you know, there was effectively a lot of money going back into South Korea from those people working over there. And I think the United States were quite important in establishing that link. And I think when the problems developed in the world economy in the mid-70s and even later, there was always the United States and the financial institutions to backstop potential problems arising. Whereas in North Korea unfortunately got in over its head with trying to get into the world economy in the 1970s and paid the price by being one of the first communist states to default. And that's actually a major impediment now to any financial institution, let alone the IMF, providing any money. They are still technically in default. The three shocks, down but not out. The fall of the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union was the major trade partner, and that went from $2.5 billion inside a couple of years to less than $100 million. So that had an impact. There's no doubt about it. In fact, some of the figures that I've seen is that GDP collapsed by 60%, which I think would put it on up there with Georgia. I think Georgia was the one the worst hit after the fall of the Soviet Union. But I've seen certain commentators have said even higher, 90%. And therefore you've got this sort of interesting, that the whole of the economy collapses, but because of the military first, which is an ideological, military-driven economic, the military-industrial complex almost remains untouched. So the military-industrial sector jumps dramatically by virtue of the fact that the rest of the economy has collapsed. You've also got deep resistance by the military to accepting any cuts or even diversion of fuel from that sector to try and assist the civilian or the non-military economy, because a lot of the North Korean economy was being fueled quite literally by Soviet oil imports. That suddenly, if you can't pay cash on the dollar, we will not supply you. And that led to problems, a lot of the industry falling, collapsing. We also had a set of natural disasters that happened between 95 and 96, devastating floods. I spoke to an individual who actually went out to North Korea to set up the British Embassy. He was telling me he'd been out there and about 30% of the country had been devastated by floods. And even coal mines had been flooded and then of course had frozen in the winter. So suddenly one of the major props of the North Korean economy, because in the absence of oil, they were, about 70% of energy in North Korea is coal. Suddenly they had problems with the coal being mined and also getting that coal to places where the factories were. That led to famine, reliance on foreign aid. I think I've seen figures that says that North Korea was either the second or third largest recipient of food aid after countries like Bangladesh and Ethiopia. I've already referred to the collapse of the public distribution system, massive industrialization as evidenced by rising scrap metal sales across the border. But you also have the rise of the markets, which I've alluded to, and particularly the growth of the private entrepreneurs. And the KPA have got themselves in on that by part of the legislation which says that, okay, you can't own private property, but if you register it with a state body, that you can come to some official lease arrangements. And that's, a lot of people have gone to shelter underneath the KPA, the Korean People's Army, or other parties in the state to actually, develop in private entrepreneurial business. You also have the sort of subsistence agriculture, people trying to grow food for themselves on the mountain slopes, and also selling across the border to China for hard cash. And the final point on that was the aspiring to the shadow core, and obviously with the collapse of the Soviet Union, North Korea very much decided it needed to go for an insurance policy by going for its own nuclear bomb. Back to the future, I don't want to, again, I'm very conscious of time, but I've already talked about the Kaesong industrial complex. 88% of total trade. Sorry, that's a bit down, Kaesong, 76%, I apologise. 76% of total intra-Korean trade was going through the Kaesong industrial complex. And that was going to effectively to meet a growing trade deficit with China. The trade has really increased over the years, and North Korea has become increasingly dependent on the Chinese. But the constitution of exports, again, raise serious issues about what its real status is, and it's drifting back to peripheral status. Not this time as being a peripheral state of Japan, but peripheral state of China, by virtue of the fact that it's really just providing primary resources like effectively agricultural goods, but also coal and other minerals. On the road to transition, I think I was asked just to give an idea. This is the data that I came up with. It's based on a 2009 study. Income blend, that's per capita GDP, is, you know, it is not even a tenth. It's what, 1/15 of South Korea. Yeah, 1/10. And if you think about the fact that, according to statistics, 1970 they were 3 times wealthier than South Korea, you have sort of a demonstration of, you know, how far DPRK has fallen, and actually how the Republic of Korea has developed with the aid assistance that it had and other assistance it had from the United States. Life expectancy, I actually believe North Korea has peaked at about 71, but by virtue of the famine, its sort of life expectancy obviously deteriorated sharply. Very, very high level of education there, though. I read one story that apparently people had gone to a nursery school in Pyongyang to see 5-6-year-olds, and they were being tutored on military tactics of Kim Il-sung. You know, that again, military training starts early in North Korea. It's part of the militarized state. The road to transition. I think what you can say is that there is a stealth transition going on. I think the changes that happened in the 90s arose, as I said, from the collapse of the public distribution system, the growth of markets as people initially tried to feed themselves. But you've obviously got this sort of an umbrella, or I believe the Russian expression would be krisha, that's developed with the KPA, or special services, providing sort of informal protection. I know that there's unofficial financial markets going out there where you can borrow money, something like 15-20%, and the people who make sure that you pay are effectively people from the Korean People's Army. The Korean People's Army have become major players, I think I alluded to earlier, in things like construction and the agricultural sectors. Agricultural sectors gives them access to food, as well as them protecting food resources from people who want to get at that. They also grow their own food, and the suspicion is some of that food is going across the border into China or finding its way into the private farmers' market systems as their sort of revenues. And I think what I would say is, you know, North Korea has come back full circle. You know, where does it go from here? Is it as part of a unified Korean state, or as a peripheral status, tributary state of China? You know, I leave that as an open question. I think quite clearly the third choice is for them to do what they're doing, which is to muddle through and hope for the best. I think, sorry, maybe I go back. That's the young leader there at the bottom, Kim Jong-un, who took over. The thing I would also say is that, you know, can it make an effective transition? I mean, if I look at Poland, I mean, one of the things there is, and again, it's interesting about the military, is that, you know, certainly certain commentators say that, you know, never mind the headlines about solidarity and Lech Wałęsa, in fact, the reality was, because the military and the special services are so involved in the economy, that they came to a deal with the opposition to hand over the power, and in return they were allowed to keep the assets. I don't believe that's a sort of a wide-eyed view. I think that probably speaks a lot about the reality. The problem is there was an opposition for the army to talk to in Poland. There isn't one in Korea right now. And you also have a look at more regional Myanmar. Again, you had an opposition there that was obviously thwarted from taking power in the elections, and the army took the place. But, you know, the army are very, very powerful actors in the economy, and obviously clearly they retain a significant predominant position in the economy. Could I say the same about North Korea right now? No, I don't think there's any opposition there. You've got a very, very highly mobilised economy, highly militarised. A lot of the workforce that would probably be unemployed, that might be demonstrating a change, was in uniform under conscription, and there's not much sort of cause for hope in that particular area. So I think that's where we are. North Korea possibly is a tributary state of China, or back as the unified Korean state, but more likely muddling through, for at least for the foreseeable future. Thank you.
So, thank you. Please, your questions. Remarks, please.
Thank you very much for a very good presentation. I have one small question about economics of the Northern Korea. Well-known Russian scientist Lenkov a lot of talks about the black market of the North Korea. Is the value of this black market really big, or in fact nothing changes? How it can change the future of the North Korea, this black wild market?
I'm aware of the books by Lenkov. He's actually written a very good last book, which was the North Korea. The last Stalinist nation, I think. It's just come out in the last few months. I actually read that with a lot of interest. Yes, Lenkov's view is actually not that different from quite a few other authors. I think the only thing that I would say is that there is still a lot of debate on how big the black economy is. I mean, I have seen a figure that says basically 70% of all income in North Korea comes from the black economy. I actually believe that figure is probably not that far out from the reality, but it's very difficult because there's no real statistics even on what North Korea's real economy is supposed to be, let alone the black. I think there's just a lot of estimates. But I would say that Lenkov's guesstimate, I think it is that, is probably not too far off the reality. I think you've got people over in China working illegally. They bring back their money. There's a lot of yuan and dollars, you know, in the North Korean economy arising from that. There's a lot of illegal trade, I believe, going across the border into China. In fact, a lot of the stories have been from the 90s is that the military is also quite heavily involved in this. I think I've alluded to the fact they're quite heavily involved in the mining sector, the agricultural sector. I mean, there's a lot of suspicion that, you know, not all monies have been accounted for, and some of that stuff has found its way either across the border into China or into the private farmers' markets. So yes, I think Lenkov is very much there or thereabouts.
Just curious, thank you for your very insightful and penetrating presentation. Sheds new light on North Korean society and politics. I'm just curious if there are any opportunities for conspicuous consumption of this rising strata or class of people who have managed to amass some resources and wealth, or there are none.
That's actually quite an interesting question. A lot of the conspicuous consumption that is taking place is in Pyongyang. I mean, I think Pyongyang has quite transformed itself over the last few years. I think there's a lot more restaurants out there, breweries. I think I was reading a story about apparently how some British brewery had been bought up by the North Koreans and shipped over from Wiltshire to produce the sort of local Taigongdang beer or whatever. There's a big thing about it. So clearly Pyongyang seems to be the centre of where a lot of the consumption's going on. Conspicuous, I'd be a little careful about that particular expression because I don't think it's quite arrived at the Chinese Maseratis or sons of leaders driving Ferraris and crashing with their girlfriends. I don't think it's reached that stage. I think there is a reasonable amount of money, but I think big money of the China or even the Russian elite standards, no, not by any means. But there is definitely a consumer society developing. And some of that is demonstrated in things like the sales of mobile phones, or even DVDs, recorders. I mean, I think there's a lot of sort of figures coming out that, you know, there's a lot of, you know, DVD players are very popular, particular parts of the country, but, you know, it's in the home, as it were, and people are watching it themselves rather than it being a public, conspicuous exercise of let's go for our spin and a Ferrari.
And what about mobile phones?
Mobile phones has increased. I mean, it's an interesting thing because I think it actually just goes to show that, you know, that there is a sort of, you know, well, Lankov calls it a hardline Stalinist. Actually, it's not quite that much, but the mobile phone network is quite an interesting story because North Korea actually has quite close connections with Egypt. And in fact, the Egyptian company Orascom, whose owner was linked to Mr. Mubarak, basically got the concession for the mobile phone in North Korea. And I think they've got something of the order of about 1 million subscribers. The figure's publicly available, and they have demonstrated significant growth. The issue, of course, is that the North Korean security services are listening in on all the phones. So it's almost like a closed network system that they can listen in on what people are doing. What is more interesting, I'm not sure whether the statistics have caught up with it, but there's clearly people have brought in mobiles from China. And they're using Chinese base stations, but presumably you've got issues of coverage or whatever. Those figures are not well known yet, but I would also suspect that they are not inconsiderable. Clearly it's outside of the potential monitoring of the state. The mobile phone is right. It's happening both on an official and on an unofficial basis. Real growth.
Thank you.
Okay. One more question, please.
And if the North Korean regime will fall, what do you think will happen to the North Korean society, to the people of North Korea? Will they become part of South Korea? Will they join the South Korea, or will they stay sort of periphery for South Korea?
I mean, it's a very good question. I think, let me just sort of try and work through the aspect. The big problem that, let me take it from another way. What has happened over the last few years is that quite a lot of people have left North Korea to go into South Korea. I believe the figures are about 20,000 now. 20,000 people have got out. And that has really only changed in the last, I'd say, 10 years, 5 to 10 years. So the figures have really leapt quite considerably. These people are coming out through China and goodness knows what. There are real issues that the South Koreans have probably not quite brought on board themselves that have come to the fore in terms of the fact that quite a lot of those people have got absolutely no skills to bring to the table. You know, they've got no, you know, even the language is a different. It would be like sort of, you know, people talking Ukrainian from the 19th century, from the 21st century. I mean, there's quite significant language issues and mentality issues and skills issues. And in fact, what I was reading was that quite a lot of people have just basically who've come over and said, it isn't working for us in South Korea, we need to go somewhere else. And the South Korean society itself views North Koreans as being inferior as well. That's also quite clear. And I think, I think there's a lot of, it hasn't really been thought through by a lot of people. I mean, I know that everyone's got this thing, it will just be like Germany. It will cost a bit more money, but it's all going to work. Well, I mean, I don't believe anyone seriously in soul, the higher reaches, really believes that. I think the thing that they tried to do is they tried to get the North Korean economy to at least pep up. I mean, I know that one of the leaders, presidents of South Korea, he announced one of his goals was to try and raise the average income in North Korea to 3,000. I think you saw the figure I quoted. I think you're not even half of the way there. And, I think that the issues of this country being absorbed is of a bigger nature than anything that might be envisaged by the West taking over East Germany. I mean, the figures are trillions of dollars. I mean, that's bigger than South Korea's GDP. I mean, the enormity of the task is huge. I don't think, I think I've read one scenario which is it ain't going to be West Germany, East Germany, it's going to be like Yemen. It's just going to be war. And you've got remember, okay, you've got 1 million people in the Korean People's Army. I grant you, I had this discussion with Papa. Yes, okay, not all of them are highly professional, special forces, people who made military their career or standing army. But I think if anything, Afghanistan and Iraq has demonstrated anyone with an AK-47 and access to explosives can make life very, very uncomfortable for people who they perceive to be an occupying force. And the South Koreans will be perceived as an occupying force. And that may well be exemplified by a rather foolish chap that's come out of South Korea, which sort of goes along the lines as, once we take over that place, that land, that belonged to my grandfather, we're going to take it back. I mean, that when you've got that sort of talk, I don't think any reunification is going to be accomplished easily, both from a financial, cultural, social, or economic ability. I mean, the task is going to be immense. So, thank you. Sorry if that's gloomy, but I think North Korea has to get itself more on the, to raise its income quite considerably before that could even be considered. But I think it will be a long-term solution. Okay.
So, may I put one question? We know some examples when the armed forces became the economic actors. We can take the cases of Indonesia under Sukarno and later under Suharto, and the case of Egypt under Sadat and Mubarak.
Yeah.
What do you think about the prospect of transformation of the North Korean army into the economic actor, into the actor of future bureaucratic capitalism?
I actually think that is going to be the way forward, but I'm still trying to mull over how that could take place. But I actually believe that is going to be the way it's going to go. I don't think it's going to be a sort of a mutiny, or that may well be. I can't rule that out. But I actually think you raise a very, very serious point. The only issue that I might have with that scenario is right now the military is benefiting from the current status. I mean, it still has a disproportionate amount of the government revenues going through. So I think that figure is now about 15–16%. The issue is that it's still a massively influential body in the body politic. I mean, these are people who, to borrow the Northian framework, are a nexus between political, economic, and violent capacity. They are major determinants of the succession. They arbitrated clearly between the family as to who took over after Kim Jong-il died. They have the protection rights over this new economy. They also have massive prestige by virtue of the fact that they are linked in with the Kim family, by virtue of their history. But they clearly are major economic agents by virtue of their involvement in construction, agriculture, the mining, the transport. So you have to wonder whether at some point that's got to be the way, but it's going to be a very, very bitter pill for the Americans to swallow, which is the people who they hate, despise, because these people did fight them to a standstill, albeit the Chinese assistance. How would they sell it to their own electorate and their own aid bodies that we may well have to deal with the military to come to a solution? And I think until Washington actually is prepared to reach out and make that leap of imagination, I think it's going to be very, very difficult. And I think it's quite clear that these sanctions have not just hemmed in North Korea's ability to trade in the wider world, because that's clearly what's happened. You know, some of it might also be the fact that the North Koreans are not interested. We concentrate on trying to deal with our own market. But also the sanctions are being directed at military bodies, you know, military-owned banks, military-owned trading companies, because this clampdown on monies getting to the regime, and that may not be a very wise decision when it comes to that particular scenario involving, because I actually genuinely believe that will be the scenario that's probably most likely to happen. But it needs the Americans to probably row back on some of these sanctions measures. I think actually North Korea has to come into the world economy at some point, because in a sense it's there. It's just not visible to a lot of people.
Okay, so thank you very much. And now, finishing our workshop, finishing our sessions, I'd like to make 4 notices. At first,